Hello and welcome to today's episode of Piano TV. So for this Q&A session today, I'm digging into the archives again. An old question that was asked, just a whole bunch of questions all in one about scales. So I want to sit down and let's just talk about scales today. And without further ado, let's get started. When is the best time to begin learning scales? What tricks and tips are there in memorizing scales, like the finger number patterns and the key patterns and shapes? Do I need to start at 2 octaves, both hands together, or start with 5-finger micro scales, hands separate? What is the speed I should start and work towards? How long should it take to learn each scale, etc.? How long should it take to learn each scale? We've talked about this already, but it should take a really, really long time for the most part. Stretch it out. Take a whole year to learn 24 pentascales. Take 1 month to learn a single scale. There's no need to rush this. I know I've said this a million times, but if you're spending half an hour regularly a day at the piano, there's no reason you should be doing scales and other technique for more than 5 minutes. It's really just as a little warm up. So you don't need to learn like a scale a week or anything like that. We usually move more at a pace of like 1 every 2 weeks or 1 every month even, depending on the grade and how much other technique we're learning. Because there's more to technique than just scales too. There's also, you can do triads, you can do arpeggios, 4-note chords. There's a whole bunch of other things that you can end up doing. So scales are really going to be like a very small portion of your entire technical repertoire that you build over the years. Scales are obviously really useful to learn, so I don't want to downplay them too much and make you think that you can just skip them. It doesn't really matter. I do think they're important, but you want to play the long game with them. You don't want to be doing, I don't think that there would be any point of doing 4-octave hands together really fast, grade 9 level scales when you're just starting out, even for like the first several years. So yeah, play the long game with those guys. Many adult beginners are completely overwhelmed with scales, and not even just beginners, like more advanced intermediate students as well, because there are so many of them. You have your basic 12 major scales, but then you also have 12 minor scales, but then you also have 24 other minor scale variations, not to mention all of the different types of scales like blues and pentatonic and chromatic scales and variations like that. And there are so many ways to play these 48 scales. Like you can just do like simple 5-finger scales. You can do 1 octave, 2 octave, 4 octave, hands together, hands separate. And yeah, there's so many different ways to play scales that it's no wonder that people are generally quite overwhelmed by them. So the first question there is, when should I start learning scales? And my answer for that is right away. However, when my students start learning scales, they generally just spend the first few months doing 5-finger scales. And even then, we usually only do the white key scales, which would be 7 different keys. It's not very many. And within the year, we'll usually expand to do all of the 5-finger scales, so all of the major and minor 5-finger scales, and that would be 24 in total in an entire year. And in addition to that, we'll usually do a couple of the easier major scales, just like 1 octave, like C scale and D and F and G scale. So a year for just that, for all the 5-finger scales and just a few 1-octave scales, might seem really, really slow, but I don't feel that there's actually like an impetus to go faster than that. And going this slow allows the students to really internalize the scales instead of struggling to remember them. A motivated adult beginner could do all of this in less than a year if you really wanted to. Like if you wanted to accelerate the process to 6 months, that's fine too. But that's just my general rule of thumb. And then after that point, after the beginner phase, once the student starts getting into grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, etc., I tend to follow the syllabus. So I'll follow the Royal Conservatory syllabus or ABRSM syllabus, and follow their technical suggestions for each level. And with the students, I'll spend 6 months to a year at each level, and then we'll just follow whatever technique they require at those levels. So then, are there any tips or tricks to memorizing the scale patterns? We'll talk about this more throughout the video, but as I was just saying, the easiest way to memorize scales is to not do too many all at once. Most of my students have no problem memorizing scales if we do them naturally and gradually over time, just because they just get so used to them because we're just doing the same scales for many weeks in a row as opposed to trying to learn a brand new scale every single week. Start with several 5-finger scale patterns. I think 4 is a good number to start with. Since there's only 5 notes to play in a 5-finger scale, you should have no trouble at all memorizing 4 different patterns. You should be able to do this in like 5 minutes or less. I have young students who are able to do this quickly. C, G, D, and A are what I consider to be the best starter 5-finger scales because they're the simplest. And once you're really, really comfortable with those, move on to the next 4 and then the next 4 until you've covered all 24 major and minor 5-finger scales. Again, I usually give my students a full year for this process. At that point, these scales are so ingrained that they become second nature, and that's why we spend so much time on them. For longer scales, learn scales with similar finger patterns at the same time. For example, you might start with C, G, and D scales, major scales. All of these have exactly the same finger patterns where your fingers move at the same time. So for example, the right hand, if you look at my right hand here, playing a C scale, finger 1, 2, 3, thumb. If I do that with D scale, 1, 2, 3, thumb. If I do that with G scale, 1, 2, 3, thumb. And it's the same with the left hand. Using scales and learning scales that have the same finger switching patterns will help burn it in your memory. Because if you're trying to learn all the major scales all at once, it can be really tough for them to be triggered in your memory because some of them have really different patterns. As for actually memorizing the shapes of scales, I find that having a really strong theoretical understanding of music helps a lot. If you're learning a scale and it's just a random series of notes that mean nothing to you, it's going to be harder to remember. But if you know that the key of D has 2 sharps, an F sharp and a C sharp, and that's like, you don't even really have to think about that, that's just like information in your head, then when you go to play that scale, that shape is just going to be so much more easy to visualize because you already understand like the theory behind the scale. So definitely don't skimp on learning the different key signatures, learning a little bit of theory when you're learning these scales. What scales should you start with? As I already mentioned, I always start with a few of the basic 5-finger scales. Usually we'll start with the C, G, D, and A. Those are the first 5-finger scales I teach. They're the easiest to learn. They have the simplest shapes. And then from there, we'll expand into all 12 major 5-finger scales, and then once those are really good, we expand into the next 12 5-finger scales and learn 24 over the span of 6 months to a year. I already talked about this, so I won't go too much more into detail, but we'll also learn a couple 1-octave scales. The easiest ones to start with are going to be C and G and D. And F's pretty simple too, but it's got a different finger pattern in the right hand, which can throw people off. Again, after that point, you can just pick a syllabus, learn the grade 1 technique, work on that for 6 months to a year, then learn grade 2 technique, work on that for 6 months to a year, etc. There's no need to rush. I think it's so much more important to spend your time on music as opposed to scales. Scales are meant to be warm-ups. They're meant to be like a little 5-finger practice before getting into your material. So it doesn't make sense to spend 20 minutes on scales and then 20 minutes on music. Focus on the music. Okay, so what speed should you be playing your scales at? There's no hard and fast rule here for the most part. For 5-finger scales, I find that most of my students can do about 100 beats per minute in 1/8 notes by a year. So da 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 da. I think it's about that speed or so. You should be pretty comfortable at that tempo. And to put things into perspective, the ABRSM at a grade 1 level expects you to be able to play scales at 60 beats per minute in 1/8 notes. So 60 beats per minute is clock speed. So if you think about, that's about how fast a clock ticks. Da, 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 da. So full octave scales don't need to be fast in the beginning. It's more important that you memorize the patterns in the early phases than you play really, really fast. The speed will come when you start playing more at an intermediate and advanced level and you've already like really, really internalized the patterns. And when you're a beginner, your technical skills, your finger technique is not usually going to be great. So there's no point in trying to go super, super fast when your fingers haven't developed the basic coordination to play it like a more moderate tempo. So these things, these fine motor movements and technical development can take years. So there's no need to rush the process. And that is all for today's discussion on scales. I hope you found this video helpful, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up. It means a lot to me when you do. Subscribe if you haven't already, and you can go check out the cards at the end of this video if you want to see the, social media links and stuff like that. You can also come visit us over on Patreon. So I'll catch you in the next video. Many adult and